Well, welcome to managing fruit tree insects. So let's just face it, let's get it out there right now. It's really disappointing to see insect pests destroy our fruit. We put a lot of effort into planting and growing our fruit trees. We look forward to enjoying the fruits of our labor. It's difficult to see our fruit being destroyed by pests. But remember, dealing with pests is just a natural part of managing your backyard orchard. Here. For some reason this is messing up. Yeah. Usually I like to do the arrow keys. This thing doesn't always work so great. Yeah. Okay, great. Okay. Okay. All right, so today what we're going to do is look at attracting beneficials and discouraging pests. And we're going to use this process called integrated pest management. It's a pretty big name, so we'll just refer to it mostly as IPM. And there's a couple of tenets here involved with integrated pest management, or IPM. And one is that you want to create a healthy fruit tree. Because think about it, if your tree is under stress, it's going to be more vulnerable to pests. Another thing is with IPM, they are specific techniques that you can do to reduce pests with your fruit tree. So it makes it less desirable for pests. Now, IPM was created in response to an over-reliance on chemical use or insecticide use. So part of IPM and WSU also state only use the least toxic pesticides when necessary. So this is the process for IPM right here, and we're going to go through these different steps. So this would be kind of the framework of our talk. So identifying your insect, is it a pest or is it a beneficial? And then there are these management practices, which include these different techniques that you can do to reduce pests in your backyard orchard. So they fall into these different categories: cultural, physical, biological, and then chemical control if necessary. And then the last step is monitoring. Now, in this talk, I won't be talking about using insecticides or chemical control. We would need another whole hour to do that, so we won't be discussing that. I do want to remind you that insecticides will not prevent problems in the future. They just reduce the population at the time. They can also kill your beneficials, which isn't a good thing. So this talk is going to be about how to mitigate problems through cultural, physical, and biological control. So our first step in the IPM process is to ID your insects. If it was only this easy. But it's really important because if you don't know what the insect is, you're not going to know how to respond to it. So it's time to gather your resources. Now, guides could be a good resource, but they can also be a bit overwhelming. Remember, there's 900,000 species of insects in the world. So it's probably not time to pull out Insects of the World, or even Guide to the Insects of North America. Get as local as you can. Also, we keep talking about the plant diagnostic clinic through WSU Master Gardener. So you're very welcome to contact us. Come to our diagnostic clinic starting March 11, Mondays from noon to 3 at the W2 building in Shelton. So it's a great opportunity. We always have folks coming in with little mason jars with insects in them and asking, can you figure out what this is? So it's a great opportunity. You're also welcome to, if you're not able to come in, use the email, masonmastergardener@gmail.com, and you can take some pictures of the insects and send them to us. Another resource is kind of nice in that it's online. That is through WSU. It is called WSU Board Sense. So to get there, all you have to do is Google WSU Board Sense, and you're taken to this home page. It has a lot of options there. The bottom option, right on the, see here, is actually mentions insects. So I think what we'll do is we will just click on that one, and you'll notice there's this sidebar when we're taken to the next page, and that sidebar lists all these insect pests. So let's say that you are out in your orchard and you're looking around and you see, oh, there's this insect on here and it looks a little bit like a stink bug, but I'm not sure if it is. So you think to yourself, well, let's look down this list here. And you see something fourth down, it says brown marmorated stink bug, and you think, well, maybe that's it. What do I have to lose? I'm going to click on it. And you're taken to an entire page then on the brown marmorated stink bug. So this is really valuable as you're trying to ID out insects. So notice there's a picture, so that helps with ID. But there's also a written description in that section on biology that will go through and it points out the significant points that you need for identifying that insect. So it'll tell you what are the things that you need to look at. That section will also tell you what type of metamorphosis it goes through, either complete or incomplete. It'll tell you if it's native or non-native, and it will list host plants that you would see it feeding on. So really valuable. And if you look at the very bottom here, it says management options non-chemical. That is your IPM prescription. So it tells you exactly what to do to reduce the pests. So really valuable resource. Now I also want you to remember that an insect will have an adult and an immature form as part of their life cycle. So the larval form will look very different from the adult form. Now, there is also a stage in between that larval form and the adult form. Does anybody know what that stage is called? What was it? Pupa. Very good. So is the larvae go through different instars as they grow and develop. Eventually they reach their last instar. I heard the word instar come up. And then they will create a case or a cocoon around them, and before they become an adult. So in that case, that larval body will physically break down, and then it gets reformed as an adult insect. And I'm only mentioning that because we will be talking about pupa a little bit. So let me get a sip here. Okay, so now we've identified our insects. So our second step in IPM is to determine, is this insect a pest or is it a beneficial? So beneficials have a positive effect on your fruit trees. And basically, the beneficials will fall into one of these three categories: pollinators, predators, or parasitoids. So in looking at them, the pollinators benefit as they will move pollen from the male part of the flower to the female part of the flower. And if that transfer is successful, it can result in the formation of a fruit. The predators, like this big robber fly here, will feed on other insects, and that helps to keep populations low. And then the parasitoid, this particular parasitoid is trichogramma, and it actually is a parasitoid that will feed on the codling moth caterpillars. So the parasitoids have a technique where they will lay their eggs either on or in another insect or that insect's egg. The parasitoid larvae then will emerge out of that egg, and the larvae will feed on and kill that insect. So let's just take a look here. So let's start with pollinators. And of course, we're going to talk about mason bees. So mason bees are a really efficient bee at pollinating your fruit trees. They're an early bee, and they tend to emerge around the same time that your blossoms appear. So because of this, they are often referred to as the orchard bee. Now, one of the reasons that they are such a good pollinator is the fact that they carry pollen on their abdominal hairs. So see all of this area right here? That's where they will carry the pollen. So now think about a mason bee that's buzzing around and it's moving through an orchard and it sees a flower and it lands right on it. Well, some of the pollen from that flower now will get attached to those abdominal hairs. Now the mason bee takes off again and flies over to the next flower, plops down on it. Some of the pollen from the previous flower now gets deposited on this new flower. The mason bee is incredibly good at pollination as well as cross-pollination. It's estimated that they can visit 1,100 flowers in a day. Busy as a bee. All right, so to encourage mason bees to pollinate your fruit tree, a lot of us have these nesting boxes in our backyards. Everybody here have one, or a few of you, at least I know a lot of you have one. So they are these boxes, they have these, or you could use paper tubes. They have these hollow tubes. The mason bee will go out and provision their nests, so they'll bring in pollen and nectar into those tubes and then lay their egg. The larvae then will develop inside those tubes. Now the boxes are hung off to the southeast. So as you put them into your yard, you hang them to the southeast. Does anybody know why you hang them to the southeast? Morning sun. Morning sun, exactly. So think about it. All insects are cold-blooded. So that morning sun hits those boxes and it starts to warm up the box. And then the bees start to warm up and then they can get out and start to forage. All right, now let's look at our next group of beneficials, which are our predators. So predators are beneficial in that they help to control pest population. So they'll attack and feed on other insects, and in this way they're going to keep those populations low. Now these are crabbed beetles here. Crabbed beetles, you sure have seen them before. They're moving around on the ground, so they're a ground beetle. And as they're moving around, they're looking for food. So they're looking for larvae and pupae. There's a lot of pupae that will live in soil. So some of the things that the crabbed beetles will feed on are codling moths, spotted Drosophila, as well as apple maggot, both larvae and the pupae. Other predators, the green lacewing, really delicate, beautiful insect, but it's the larvae, which is right here, looks a bit more like an alligator. It has these big sickle-like mouth parts. It will impale its prey, and then it will inject a paralyzing venom and feed. And they are predators of codling moth. Also think about any time you see a spider in your garden, it's a predator, it's a beneficial. Now let's talk about the parasitoids. This is a bit of an unusual group. So the parasitoids are beneficials. They have this unique strategy though, in that they will lay their eggs either on or inside their prey host. So the eggs then will develop, the larvae will emerge, and they will feed and kill that insect. So an example of a parasitoid is the samurai wasp, which you can see right here. So this samurai wasp is used in biological control of the brown marmorated stink bug. Now, she is only going to live to be about 10 days, that's her lifespan as an adult, but in that time, she will lay 100 eggs into brown marmorated stink bug eggs. Those samurai wasp eggs will hatch, the larvae emerge, and they will feed and kill those stink bug eggs. Also, there are tachinid flies. The tachinid flies, though, will lay their eggs on top of insects like these seed bugs here. The tachinid fly the eggs will hatch and the larvae will burrow into the insect and then feed on it and kill it. The tachinid fly is also a predator of codling moth and other caterpillars, like tent caterpillars. All right, so we've looked at our beneficials, and now let's take a look at some of the insect pests. So insect pests in terms of your fruit trees are going to cause damage by ruining the food value of the fruit, as well as by making it just aesthetically unpleasing. So we're going to look at 4 different insect pests, and I spoke with the person at WSDA who just previously ran the pest program, and he identified these 4 pests as the key pests to look at. And when I did research through WSU, they also identified these as the key pests to look at in terms of your fruit trees. So we're going to look at apple maggot, codling moth, spotted wing Drosophila, and the brown marmorated stink bug. Now, out of all of these insects that you're seeing here, these pests, none of them are native to the Pacific Northwest or to Washington State. But one of them is native to North America. Does anybody know which one that is? Stink bug? Not stink bug, they're from Asia. Well, I guess I should go on here. It is the apple maggot. Apple maggots are native to the east coast of North America, and originally their native host plants were crab apples, the native crab apple, as well as hawthorns. But then as people came from Europe hundreds of years ago in these sailing ships, they brought apples with them, and so they extended their host to apples. So let's take a look. We'll start with apple maggot and go through each one of these pests right now. So apple maggot as a fly, adult fly, is about a ½ an inch in length, and notice it has these clear wings with these black stripes on them. The female will use her ovipositor, so that's part of the female's body that will deposit the eggs into either plant or animal material. So she will use her ovipositor to puncture the skin of the apple and lay her eggs. So in time, those eggs hatch and the larvae emerge. The larvae for the apple maggot are cream colored, they do not have legs, and they do not have a defined head capsule. So welcome to the world of a maggot. The larvae also, as they work their way through the apple, as they feed, they create these tunnels. They become these brown tunnels of rot and just make a real mess out of your apple. They destroy your apple. Now, this is a state-regulated pest. So this is a map of Washington, and you see the red area here, Western Washington. It is infected with apple maggot. The green area is apple maggot free. So that includes eastern and central Washington for the most part. And I'm sure you're very aware of what a big industry apples are for our state. You know, when you think of our state, you think of apples, iconic. It actually we produce $2.2 billion every year in the apple industry. Most of the apples actually come out of central Washington. So it's really important for the state that we don't mess up central Washington and eastern Washington with apple maggots. So there's a quarantine area, and just so you're aware, this is really amazing. 80% of the apples in western Washington are infected with apple maggot. Wow. So this is a really important thing, that we don't transport apples into these apple-free areas and mess things up. So now let's take a look at the codling moth. So notice the adult moth is grayish in color. It has these coppery bands at the tip of its wings. Look how pretty that larvae is. It's pink, it has this defined head capsule, and it has 6 legs. Now, the adult moth will deposit her eggs either on the apple or on leaves. Those eggs will hatch, and they'll make their way to the apple, where the larvae then will burrow into the apple. So as they burrow in, they will take some of the material of the apple with their own excrement. It's called frass, and they'll push it out of the apple as they're burrowing in. So I should say codling moth will target apples and pears, and they are heading to the center of the apple, where they are primarily going to feed on seeds. This is called a deep entry, and as you can see, if you ever see an apple with these areas of frass sticking out, you know who is in there as codling moth. The spotted winged Drosophila, the next insect that we'll talk about, is a fly. It's a very small fly, though, only 1/8 of an inch in size. It has red eyes, clear wings. The male does have a black spot on his wing, and that's how it gets the name spotted winged Drosophila. Now, once again, the female will oviposit into the fruit. The fruit can be pretty much any kind of berry. They love to target raspberries, as well as cherries. And after the egg hatches, the larvae starts to feed, and that causes the fruit to soften and collapse. And if you go to pick it, you'll find these little white threads inside the fruit, and it's a young larvae. So obviously you won't want to eat it. The larvae will pupate inside the fruit, and I think it's really interesting. So after they pupate, they emerge as an adult, and they overwinter here in Washington State. So they overwinter as adults, and they're just so delicate. And the last insect that we're going to look at is the brown marmorated stink bug. So they get the name marmorated because they have this mottled appearance, kind of brownish gray. And one of the things that you'll notice is that on them, they have these alternating bands on their legs and their antenna. They go light, dark, light, dark. Notice the rim of their abdomen, these alternating bands of light, dark, light, dark. One of the things that you look at, so you look at those things for identification, but you also look at the shoulder of the stink bug. If it's smooth, it's a stink bug. It's a brown marmorated stink bug. But if it's edged and sharp, it could be one of the native stink bugs. None of the native stink bugs are considered to be pests. So the brown marmorated stink bug is a serious pest of orchards. And it has what's referred to as piercing, sucking mouth parts. So see right here, the proboscis, see that sticking down into the apple? So it sticks this proboscis into the fruit, and it will emit a little bit of saliva. That saliva will soften the fruit, create a little bit of a slurry in the fruit, and then it sucks it up. Now you don't notice the damage right then. You don't see how they damage the apple. But as the apple continues to grow, you'll notice it because the apple grows, but those areas that were injured through feeding become dimpled areas as they do not grow. So you'll see these dimpled apples. You know that was a feeding disturbance, likely from the brown marmorated stink bug. Now, this particular insect is so impressive, it has 100 host plants. So think about that. It's in your vegetable garden, it's in your fruit. Some of the hosts for your fruit are apples, pears, stone fruit, berries, flowering cherry, and plum. So it's almost everything. So now we're going to take a look at this IPM. We know a little bit more about our beneficials and about our pests. So let's take a look at this, how we can suppress pests and encourage our beneficials. So IPM uses this pyramid to describe how to go about doing this. So the idea is in the pyramid is that you start at the bottom and you would go up a step. You would go up a step as necessary to deal with your pest. So the bottom starts with cultural, and that really revolves a lot around doing things that are preventative. And then moving up a rung, physical, you're actually getting out and doing some physical things that can stop and decrease the pest disturbance. Biological is the use of your beneficial insects, your pollinators, your predators, and your parasitoids. And then chemical is your last choice in terms of dealing with the pest. So notice the bottom really deals with prevention, it's benign. As you move up to the top, it becomes intervention and it can become toxic. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to start at the bottom of the pyramid with cultural controls, and we will work our way up. So cultural controls really provide an environment for the fruit tree so that it reduces the plant's susceptibility to pests. So you want to create a healthy fruit tree, and that's what cultural controls really deal with. So if you have been to our workshops, you know we always talk about soil, good soil. So a good loam soil is a benefit, and it's going to hold water. It's also going to allow for drainage. So the idea here in Mason County, we have such rocky soil, you want to amend your soil. So you'll want to add compost, you want to make sure that the hole when you're planting your fruit tree is a nice size, and that you've added amendments to that hole so you're not just putting it into a rocky soil where it's going to get really dry during the summer and not do well. Also remember, Jeannie mentioned cross-pollination, so just some examples of trees that need compatible pollinators. Pollinizers are apples, pears, Japanese plums, and sweet cherries. We also, Jeannie and Andrew mentioned purchasing fruit trees that are grown on dwarf rootstocks. So you want to try to keep the height of the tree 10 feet or less. And there's an advantage for that in that you can see the pests. You can look into your tree, you can see your fruit, you can look for insect damage, and you know what's going on, as opposed to if your tree is 30 feet up in the air, that upper area, you're just not going to really know what's going on. Also, it's going to be easier to harvest in the fall and require maybe even no ladder work. Also, just as Jeannie and Andrew mentioned, select fruit trees that have resistance to common diseases. These are all part of cultural controls. You want to pick trees that are well adapted to your site. And as Jeannie mentioned, for apple scab, Liberty, Premium, Williams Pride are just a few examples of trees that are resistant to apple scab. Something else to think about is that the more diverse your fruit trees are, the more resistant to pest damage. So if you only have apple trees, then you will be gathering the pests that will feed on apples. So you're concentrating a resource for a pest, and that population is going to grow. Now, I want to now look at cultural controls related to apple maggot, since it is such a dominant pest here in Western Washington. Now, this graphic comes from WSDA, and what I want you to notice at the bottom, it gives the months, and notice And then it tells you when like the adults are peaking eggs and larvae. So notice that the adult activity really starts in July and then it peaks in August. And then you're going to find that by fall, September to October, those populations of apple maggot are going to decrease. So remember that, because that's kind of a setup slide for our next slide. Picture that image. So this is some research that has been done by USDA, and in the last years, this is what they have to say. So late season apples, well, first of all, think about an apple. So as the fruit matures, the flesh becomes softer. So think about in the summer when you're looking at fruit, a lot of that fruit is really hard and green still. But as it matures, it becomes softer. So late season apples, they're green and they're harder during the summer months, July and August, when we have all of this apple maggot activity. So it becomes harder because they're harder flesh, they're more difficult for the female to oviposit into that hard flesh. They don't have as much success. Also, it's harder for the larvae to tunnel through those really hard apples. However, to give you an idea, early season apples, they're softer during the summer months, they're softer flesh, and they will have higher rates of apple maggot attack. So I talked with this researcher, and he said in just one bullet, you could say, late season, harder fleshed apples are less susceptible than earlier, softer fleshed apples for apple maggot. And he did a study here in Western Washington, and he looked at these 5 different varieties of apples. And he picked these because these are apples that are commercial. I think 60% of the apples that were grown that year in Central and Western Washington were these 5 apples. So we found that Granny Smith and Fuji, they're late season, they're hard, they were the most resistant. Red Delicious was mid-season, so it was kind of intermediate, but Gala and Golden Delicious are earlier season and soft, and they found that they were the most susceptible to apple maggot. So I also have put on your handouts, there's a link, and it will show you, WSU has a really nice little graphic that shows you which apples are early, mid, and late season. All right, now we're going to move up the rung here, and we are going to look at physical control. So in this instance, these are things that you want to do. You want to physically get out there and hand pull and use mulch to control weeds. Remember, they're going to compete for water and nutrients with your fruit trees. You can clip and dispose of branches that might get infested with insects like the fall webworm. And then a lot of us, I'm sure, need deer fencing around our little backyard orchards. Otherwise, we're going to run into some problems with deer. Irrigation might be required during the summer months. Remember how we go through very dry summers, July and August. Sometimes we don't even get any rain. So you may need to water your trees. Lack of water will cause fruit drop. It'll cause reduced fruit size as well as quality. And just like Andrew talked about pruning, it's so important. You want to open up your tree to get good sunlight penetration and aeration for growth. Now this is something in terms of physical controls that's related to apple maggot. So think about in the fall when the trees, when the apples start to fall from the trees and they are on the ground. The idea is that you want to get out and pick those up and dispose of them. It's called sanitation. So think about these apples. If you have apple maggot, there's larvae inside those apples. The larvae will crawl out. The apple maggot larvae pupate in the soil. So look at all those apples, larvae crawling out, pupating in the soil. next June, as they start to emerge, you are just basically creating a worse problem for yourself because you're going to have a lot of apple maggot emerge. So be sure to destroy the infested fruit. WSD's recommendation is to put it in a plastic bag, tie it up, set it in the sun for a week. It'll kill the larvae, and then you can dispose of it. Also, don't put it in your compost because the larvae will crawl out and pupate in your compost, and then you'll just be spreading it around your property. There's a couple things you can do for apple maggot. You could apply the kaolin clay. So that's something that you spray on, and it creates a film or barrier to the apple maggot. The kaolin clay is this really fine porcelain, and it comes out of Georgia. And it's sold as a product called Surround. And you just mix it with water and put it in one of those little pumpers and then spray it onto your tree. It's not going to kill the apple maggot, but because it does irritate them, and they'll just go to a different tree. Also, it might be that you would need to bag your fruit for apple maggot. So if you decide to bag, you're preventing the fly from getting down and ovipositing into the egg. The idea is that you would want to bag it 4 to 6 weeks after blossom drop. You would want to have it in a bag by then. So now let's take a look at physical controls that we can do for codling moth. So once again, kaolin clay and bagging your fruit are really good things that you can do. Also, just like remember how Andrew talked about removing loose material on your tree, getting rid of that, cleaning your tree. Well, the codling moth larvae, when it's in its last stage as a larvae, is going to emerge from that apple and walk down the tree and look for a site to develop, to pupate. So it'll spin a cocoon, and where it's going to look for is loose bark. So the idea is that you want to remove loose bark. By doing that, you are removing potential cocoon sites. One other thing in terms of codling moth is you can use pheromone lures for mating disruption. Now that sounds interesting. So what these lures will do, they emit a chemical attractant that mimics the female hormone. And it's in the air, and it confuses the males. They can't find the females to mate. Now, if you went over to Central Washington, you would find that they have these big aerosol dispensers that they're blowing this into the air through their orchard. This is a primary thing that they use, technique, to suppress codling moth. But if you are here in Western Washington, I'm sure you're not going to bring a big aerosol dispenser into your backyard. But you could try these chemical lures, and I brought some with me, but I forgot to bring it up here to show you. But they would very likely be very effective against codling moth. So for spotted winged Drosophila, in terms of physical controls, be sure to pick your fruit before it gets overly ripe. As it gets overly ripe, it develops more sugars, and that's an attractant to the spotted winged Drosophila. Also remember that they pupate in the fruit. So if you have fruit fall to the ground, they're going to pupate in that fruit, and it's ideal, once again, do really good sanitation, pick up that fruit on the ground, and dispose of it. So for brown marmorated stink bug, there's not much you can do in terms of physical controls. So the idea is that you would just get out there and pick it, the stink bug, squish it. You would destroy the adults, the eggs, and the nymphs. You could try net sweeping too if you see an abundance of the stink bug. So now we're going to bump up the pyramid. We're going to look at the biological controls. So really important to encourage pollinators. So especially the mason bees for effective pollen transfer, for good fruit formation. And you'll want to think about releasing your mason bees as the flowers start to bloom in your orchard so that they will then go and pollinate in your orchard. Also, plant a diversity of flowering plants, provide food for and habitat for your beneficials for both pollinators, predators, and parasitoids. You'll also want to encourage these parasitoids. These are really an important key here in terms of beneficial insects. So we said they're going to parasitize other insect pests. And this little samurai wasp that we talked about in terms of the brown marmorated stink bug. Now, both the brown marmorated stink bug and the samurai wasp are from Asia. And interesting enough, there's not a problem with brown marmorated stink bugs in Asia. And that's because this little samurai wasp will kill 60 to 90% of the brown marmorated stink bug eggs. So this little female wasp is probably one of our big superheroes in terms of gardening and having orchards. But like every superhero, there's some kryptonite involved. And for the little samurai wasp is insecticides. They are very, very sensitive to insecticides. So our last step in this process is you want to monitor. So get out and look for signs of insects in your fruit trees. One thing that you'll want to do is flip over the leaves because most of the eggs or nymphs or larvae will be on the underside of the leaves. So think about that. I was even at the Nisqually just recently and we were watching birds flipping over leaves to find insect food. Look at your fruit, look for signs of damage with your fruit, and then develop some sort of a monitoring schedule so that you would go out and think about too what's happening with the insect life cycle. Like in July and August, you know that's when apple maggots peaking, so you might want to go out and see what's happening with your fruit trees in terms of apple maggot at that time. So record what you see. When you implement some of these IPM techniques, record that you've done it, and then record what sort of results you might have. So once again, just in summary, you want to identify your insect. Is it a pest or is it a beneficial? You want to use the knowledge of the pest life cycle to target control. And then you always use the least toxic methods first to manage insect populations. And then to monitor for insect activity. Remember to use your IPM tools to manage your fruit trees. You're going to create healthier fruit trees, and you're going to help to decrease pests. So remember also that there's this incredible diversity of insects, and there's not just one prescription. So with that, I'm open to questions. Wow. Yes, Lisa.
The kale and clay, that doesn't deter deer, does it?
No, I've never heard of it deterring deer. Do you know, Francesca? I think it's just that it creates a barrier. And sometimes it's even so that the insect may not even recognize that it's an apple or a pear or whatever. So it just creates a barrier. Yeah.
Do you ever have a problem with the apples and falling off my tree building up because the deer get them immediately? If a deer eats an apple infected with one of these pests, will going through its gut basically kill the larvae?
So the question was about deer feeding and then feeding on the fruit on the ground, and will it kill the larvae inside their gut as they're processing it? I do not know the answer to that. I've been wondering about that today. Yeah.
How pervasive is samurai fly? Do
Oh,
we
good
probably
question.
have it?
Good question. How pervasive is the samurai fly or wasp? Well, what they do is they bring these in. They know in Asia, Japan, and through Asia the samurai moth is an incredible predator, parasitoid on the brown marmorated stink bug. So they decided to bring it into the United States and they put it into quarantine initially. So they put it into quarantine and they look at how effective it is, or if it has some problem that it would not be good for something else. So they've really got to look at that. And then if it gets the green light, then they will release it. But interesting enough, entomologist down in Portland was poking around and he found it a few years back that it was in Portland. And we know now it's in Oregon and in Washington. And I should also just mention for some of these things like that trichogramma wasp for collie moth, you can order these off the internet. So these are things that are available to use off of the internet that you can get. Yeah.
I have one more question in that stink bug, does it overwinter here? Is it the one that flies in your house when you
Yeah.
open the door?
So the question is the brown marmorated stink bug the one that's gonna show up in your house looking for a warm place to overwinter, and it is. That they look for cracks, opportunities to get into your house. And I've heard of stories, there was a story in, I think, the Atlantic in New York or something like that, where this person went up into their attic, and remember how attics are a little warmer and things that had gotten in, and it was just 100% filled with farm. So
They like white.
they like what?
They like white. They fly to white things.
I always have to tell you, this is really off track, but I have a dog, and whenever I find him, I take him and I put him in my hand like this, and then I go over to see if she'll smell them, and she's just like, oh my God, she just like runs away as soon as I do it. That was very off topic. Any other questions that you might have? Okay, so I think we'll take a